So, the Department of Education has launched an investigation into Washington, D.C.'s public schools. As the Trump administration is hell bent on abolishing the Department of Education, it's ironic that the deeply blue District of Columbia is targeted for an investigation by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. The issue at hand is the extremely high level of complaints filed by families seeking assistance for special needs students. And that is undeniably a very real problem. And I agree with Linda McMahon when she states in her press release the Department of Education has a solemn responsibility to protect all students from discrimination, especially our most vulnerable. We will ensure schools are fulfilling their commitment to provide all students with equal access to educational opportunities and not placing unnecessary burdens on families to fight for special education services for their children, to which they are entitled under law. But here's the ironic part. We can look to the problems with Washington, D.C. as a lens into what will happen when the Department of Education is, according to Trump's plan, abolished. The funds that are appropriated by Congress through the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, will drastically dry up, shrink, or get sucked up through misappropriation. You see, Washington, D.C., because it is not a state, already has to contend with a difficult funding issue when it comes to its public schools and special education programs. For all 50 states, education funding is generated from the state government, local property taxes, and the federal government. For example, a state like North Carolina provides 63% of education funding from the state government, 26% from local tax revenues, and 11% from the federal government. However, Washington, D.C. does not benefit from state funds because it's not a state. So 85% of D.C.'s public school funding comes from local property taxes. 11% comes from the federal government, and about 4% comes from grants or other sources. In other words, DC students and families suffer from a lack of sufficient funding. The study Linda McMahon cites in her Department of Education press release actually states the following in its findings. Chronic underfunding of special education services is a major underlying reason for the issues students with disabilities are experiencing in DC. Panelists, those who participated in the review, agreed that the federal government's failure to provide the promised funding since IDEA was enacted is a major reason that the intended objectives of special education have not been met. In 1975, Congress passed the IDEA and promised to allocate 40% of federal funding to states and Washington, D.C., that agreed to follow the IDEA. However, the funding received from the federal government has varied between 14% and 18% over the years. The school districts are left to handle a massive shortfall as a result. Each year, a bill is introduced in Congress to ensure full funding of IDEA. But this chronic underfunding of IDEA exists across all states. Since its passage, Congress has been authorized to appropriate funding equivalent to 40% of the total cost of special education, but actual funding has generally fallen below 13% of the cost of special education. States in Washington, D.C. have always had difficulty in providing the supports needed for children receiving special education services. And Washington, D.C. has not had the funds that states provide for their public schools. So, it is no surprise D.C. has difficulty funding special education programs. This is a harbinger for what is to come for all students with special needs in the future. I don't think anyone can possibly think that funding for special education will go up in the years to come. Special education has never been fully funded. In fact, special education has generally received just a little over a quarter of the funding it needs from the federal government. So we can see what will happen to special education when adequate funds are not provided. Students with special needs will be subjected to civil rights violations. Parents will find that they do not have the supports for their children, and special education teachers will lose their jobs and the ability to provide educational equity and supports for their students. You see, this is the hypocrisy of Trump and Linda McMahon as the Secretary of the Department of Education. Washington, D.C. has never received adequate funding for special education programs. None of our states have ever received even close to an adequate amount of federal government dollars to fund special education services. And because of that, our students who are already experiencing a lack of adequate services will only suffer more as funding dries up and, if Trump gets his wish, the Department of Education is abolished.